Hey everybody, happy Friday. Welcome to a new Trans 101 video. So what do we mean when we say that you have white, male, cis, hetero privilege? What is privilege? Does privilege mean that you have an easy life? Can you have one form of privilege but not another? That's what we're talking about today. Hi, I'm Dr. Rachel McKinnon, making gender make sense. Let's get started. I'm sure that you've seen people using the term privilege, and sometimes in ways that might seem confusing, or maybe even a way that seems like it's shutting down debate. Sometimes it gets used as, look, you've got male privilege, check your privilege. Well, what's going on there? What do we mean by privilege? In Tuesday's video, I talked about what's going on with the sort of check your privilege sort of comment. I suggested that there's an important epistemic point, a knowledge-related point, and I explained feminist standpoint epistemology as a way to get into that. And I made a promissory note that I'm going to make good on today to explain more clearly what privilege is. What do we mean by privilege? Are there different types of privilege? When we talk about something like male privilege, are there different types of male privilege in a structural sense? If there is different types of structural privileges, even within one category like male privilege, what sort of difference does that make? Okay, so there are different types of privilege. There's male, cisgender, heterosexual, class privileges, ability versus disability privileges, all kinds of different privileges based on our various complicated intersectional identities. We all have a variety of identity categories that we belong to. I'm an immigrant, for example, a Canadian, a woman, a trans person. I am asexual, a lesbian who's homoromantic. I am mostly able-bodied, so on and so forth. We all have complicated intersectional identities. And when we're talking about different forms of privilege, we're talking about them in terms of those identity axes. One axis of identity for me is that I'm white, another is that I'm transgender, another is that I'm a woman, so on and so forth. When we talk about people as having particular privileges, we're talking about their membership as part of a group identity. So we're not talking about privilege in terms of an individual, we're talking about it in terms of group membership along an identity axis. When we talk about male privilege, we're talking about a particular person as a member of the group males. One first important feature is that people can have some forms of identity privilege while lacking others. Also, even within one axis, some people can have more of that privilege than others. One reason we need a really clear analysis of the nature of privilege is it helps us understand what are the appropriate political, policy, social responses to the presence or absence of privilege. One reason that what I'm going to be talking about today is some work that I've done with a co-author of mine, Adam Sennett. We've published this paper in the Journal of Political Philosophy. I'll put a link in the description below. One reason we undertook this project is we noticed a problematic way that some people respond to claims of the existence of a privilege. And we noted that the correct response to various forms of privilege depends on properly categorizing that very privilege. If we treat all forms of, say, white privilege the same when they're actually importantly different, we're going to get the responses wrong. For example, some forms of privilege, what we'll call advantage privilege, should be responded to by removing the unfair advantage. But other forms of privilege, such as what we call entitlement privileges, should not be taken away. So it matters how we categorize the privileges to how we should respond to them. One more preliminary that we need to get out of the way is that when we talk about someone having a form of privilege, we don't mean that that person has an easy life. We don't mean privilege in terms of general benefit. That, well, if you have male privilege, therefore you have an easy life. You have a good life, a happy life, whatever. That's not what we mean. We mean something different. People can have forms of privilege but still have a very difficult life. That's not what we mean by privilege. So we need to set that aside and keep that distinction clear. To have a privilege is not therefore to have an easy life. For example, one can be economically disadvantaged, one can be poor, and yet still have white male cis privilege. These things are compatible. Okay, I think it's important to use examples whenever we explain difficult concepts. So I want to focus on 3 forms of male privilege in particular. The first example is men, for the most part, can walk down the street without fearing gendered harassment or catcalls. Women, on the other hand, do not have that form of privilege for the most part. Second form of privilege, men are more likely than women, given identical qualifications, to get jobs and to be more highly paid for the jobs that they do get. There's all kinds of data to back this up. For example, studies where people send out identical curricula vitae for a male name and a female name, the same CV, people were more likely to hire the man than the woman, even though the qualifications were identical. So that's another form of privilege. On the basis of your identity as being male, be more likely to get a job given identical qualifications compared to a woman. Third form of privilege is that men tend to have better and more diverse media representations of themselves. They get to be superheroes more often. For example, look at the backlash of the female Ghostbusters movie. That it was a big deal that an all-woman cast was in a movie like that shows us that men tend to have access to positive and diverse media representations that other people do not. And that is a form of privilege, that you are the sort of person where the media has positive and diverse representations of people like you. Okay, so we have our 3 cases of privilege. They are all different forms of male privilege, but let's talk about the way that people tend to talk about the nature of privilege, and I'll give some reasons why it's not a really good way to do it. Typically, when people talk about the nature of privilege, they use what we call a counterfactual claim, sometimes known as a subjunctive claim. For example, a claim like male privilege might be, well, you as a man, if you were a woman, your life would be harder in some particular gendered way. So you're a man, and someone says, what it means to have male privilege is that were you a woman, you would probably be paid less for doing the same job that you have now. A different form of a similar counterfactual is to say to a woman, what it means for someone to have male privilege is that for a woman, were she a man, she would be paid more than she currently is for the same qualifications. That's what we mean by the counterfactual view of privilege. So counterfactuals take this form: if X were the case, then Y would be the case. What we do with a counterfactual is we take a claim, a proposition that we know is false, suppose that it's true, and then ask what follows from it. For example, if Hitler were never born, what would have happened? We take something that we know did happen, suppose it's false, and then ask what would follow. What would logically be the case if it were true, even though it's false? The claim is counter to the facts, a counterfactual. We suppose it's true, ask what would follow. Some people have suggested that this is how we should think of privilege. If you were different in terms of an identity axis, then this thing would follow. If you were actually a woman, you would likely be paid less. That's a counterfactual analysis of privilege. Unfortunately, while it's a very tempting analysis of privilege, and before I started this project, it's the way I used to explain privilege, we don't think it really works. It gets some cases wrong, and it gets some of the cases right for the wrong reasons. For example, I have white privilege. One thing that means is that if I interact with the police, it's likely that that will go better for me than if I were a person of color. If we take the counterfactual analysis of privilege and we say, well, if you were to wake up tomorrow as a person of color, your life would be harder in various racialized ways. Well, that's true, but there are some ways that that's true for the wrong reasons. For example, all else being held equal, if I were to wake up tomorrow as a person of color, my life would be harder because my driver's license picture wouldn't match the way I actually look. Friends of mine probably wouldn't recognize me, and that would be a problem for my life. So my life would be harder. The counterfactual becomes true, but that's not really what we mean by privilege, is it? So the counterfactual analysis gets some cases right for the wrong reasons, and that's not what we want in a conceptual analysis of something like privilege. We can do better. We break down privilege into 3 different primary categories. There might be more, but we found 3. The first is entitlement, the second is advantage, the third is benefit. Let's go through them in order. To quote our paper, an entitlement privilege is a property a group has that every group ought to have, but at present only particular groups enjoy. Our first case of male privilege, the right not to be street harassed or catcalled, is an example of an entitlement privilege. Another form of entitlement privilege is the right to marry if we're talking about pre-marriage equality America. It's a right that some people have but other people do not. And if we think that everyone ought to have the right to marry, then the fact that some people have that right but others do not gives the people who do have the right a form of privilege. One way that we talk about straight privilege or heterosexual privilege, especially pre-marriage equality America, is that the differential access to the right to marry provides a form of privilege to straight people that queer people do not have. Second form of privilege is advantage privilege. To quote from the paper again, an advantage privilege is constituted by a group's differential or exclusive access to actions or activities that confer an advantage, but is not such that every group is entitled to such access. So with entitlement privilege, we think that these are rights that some people have access to and other people don't, but everyone ought to have access to those rights. Advantage privilege involves cases where we don't think everyone should have access to this form of privilege. Importantly, advantage privileges are, in a sense, zero-sum. They always take the form where in order to have the privilege, it means other groups must lack it. So take our second case of male privilege. The fact that men, on average, are more likely to be hired and hired at higher salaries than identically qualified women. That's a zero-sum arrangement. You cannot be more likely to be hired than another group unless that other group is less likely to be hired. We can't just extend the feature or property of more likely to be hired to women while maintaining more likely to be hired for men. In order to raise up the likelihood of women to be hired, we would have to decrease the likelihood of men being hired. That's a zero-sum arrangement. So our case 2 of male privilege is an example of advantage privilege. There are some interesting cases where there seems to be this hybrid of entitlement advantage, where differential access to an entitlement privilege, like a right that we think everyone should have, creates zero-sum advantages for that group, is its own form of hybrid privilege that we call entitlement advantage. For example, pre-marriage equality, if you're a straight person, you have entitlement access to the institution of marriage, which can provide an advantage in terms of things like tax benefits. There are tax benefits to married couples that do not extend to non-heterosexual married couples. So pre-marriage equality, some groups of people had access to this entitlement that we think everyone should have, but not everyone has, and having that differential access produces an actual zero-sum advantage. We name those forms of privilege entitlement advantage privileges. For another example, women have less access to the entitlement privilege of not being street harassed or catcalled. One consequence of this is that women feel less safe. They have less literal access to social benefits of walking out at night. They might have to take longer routes. They might have to spend money on protective measures that men don't. And if women are taking on these costs but men are not, then that's a form of advantage for men to not have to spend that money. So women's less differential access to freedom from street harassment and violence produces a disadvantage as well. So it's a form of entitlement advantage to be free from street harassment. It's important to get these distinctions right because the way that we ought to respond to different types of privileges depends on the type of privilege it is. We should not respond to entitlement privileges by taking away access to rights that we think everyone should have. We don't take away the right of walking down the street free from street harassment by harassing men. Instead, we try to extend the right of women to have the access to the same rights of walking down the street free from street harassment. We do respond to advantage privileges by taking away the zero-sum advantage. So if men are more likely to be hired than women, we need to equalize the probability that men and women will be hired given the same qualifications. Also, we should standardize the salaries that people are given their qualifications. Necessarily, the right way to respond to advantage privileges is by taking away the advantage from the privileged group. One last distinction between entitlement, advantage, and now benefit privileges. Reading from the paper one more time. Benefit privileges are forms of privilege that aid in promoting human flourishing and aren't inherently problematic, as advantage privileges tend to be, but are problematic only if one group has it but another doesn't. Our example here is one of access to positive media representations. There's plausibly no right to media representations. There's no requirement that people produce media, period. We think that having positive media representations, if there are going to be media representations of people's various identities, is a good thing. It contributes to growth and human flourishing, a happy and well-adjusted life. We don't want to take away that benefit from people if they have it. Benefit privileges only become a problem if some people have access to it but others don't. So if men, for example, have wide access to diverse representations of themselves but women do not, then this benefit privilege becomes a problem. For example, look at the way that people responded to an all-female Ghostbusters movie. It's obvious that women do not have the same sort of benefit of positive and diverse representations in media like movies, TV, and so on. Again, it's a good thing that we have media representations and positive media representations, but we want everyone to have them. It only becomes an issue in terms of a privilege if some people have it but others don't. One last distinction. We can make a distinction between positive privileges and negative privileges. Positive privileges are where we have freedom to and access to some sort of good thing. Negative privileges are when we have freedom from some sort of bad thing. In terms of male privilege, men have the positive privilege to a higher likelihood of being hired given the same qualifications as a woman, and the positive privilege to be more likely to have a higher salary. That's an access to a good thing. Freedom from a bad thing is something like men have male privilege insofar as they have relative freedom from street harassment. We don't put a ton of stock into this distinction because if we're careful, we can word any form of privilege as either a positive or a negative privilege. Men's positive privilege to be more likely to be hired given identical qualifications could be phrased as freedom from being less likely to be hired given identical qualifications. But we think that there are some privileges where it makes more sense to talk about in terms of them being positive or negative, even though we could phrase them either way. These are various different categories of privilege, but we haven't quite said yet what privilege is. So we have a view that provides a schema for what privilege is. And then, depending on small changes to the schema, we can produce advantage, entitlement, and benefit privileges. Here's what the schema looks like. Now, this is just what analytic technical philosophy looks like, a good old definition. We say that members of a group G have a group privilege P in a social setting S if and only if four conditions. First, that privilege property is generally desirable to have in that social setting S. So for example, the privilege to walk down the street free from street harassment is a generally desirable thing to have in our society. Second condition, most other groups of the same type don't enjoy that privilege. So here we're talking about group types. We're talking about axes of identity. So in this case, when we're talking male privilege, we're talking gender. Males have a form of privilege, freedom from street harassment, in terms of their gendered selves, insofar as other genders don't have the same sort of privilege. Third, the group has that privilege because of how the social or political institutions of that social setting treat membership in that group. In our misogynistic, sexist society, we treat men differently than how we treat women, especially in terms of things like street harassment and entitlement to comment, things like the male gaze, so on and so forth. Because of the social setting and how we differentially treat different groups of this type, namely gender, men have a form of privilege because they are men and society treats them that way. That's what this third condition is doing. Fourth condition is that the group does not deserve to have this generally desirable property merely in virtue of comprising a member of a group of that type. Here what we mean is that there are some properties of some groups where we think having a form of privilege is a good thing in virtue of being a member of that group. For example, the right to prescribe medicine is a generally desirable property that we give to people with medical doctor degrees. So doctors have the privilege to prescribe medicine in virtue of comprising a member of the group of doctor. At least the medical kind of doctor, not my kind of doctor. But for other types of privilege, like male privilege, we don't think it's fair that we differentially give this privilege to a member of this group type but not others, merely because a person is a member of that group. So there we have it, a schema for what privilege is. And we can pick out whether something is an advantage, a benefit, or an entitlement privilege just by small tweaks of each of these parts. Also, it lets us know what privilege is in a more precise way than the problematic counterfactual analysis we talked about earlier. Finally, a distinction between specific and overall privilege. Often, when people talk about privilege, they make a mistake where they say, well, the only thing that matters is wealth or socioeconomic class. Someone who is wealthy, no matter who they are in terms of their identity, is better off overall, is more privileged overall than someone who is poor but has a more dominantly situated identity. For example, a wealthy lesbian black woman is said to have more overall privilege than a poor straight white male. We don't think that this is a very useful way to talk about privilege though, because this gets us into the oppression Olympics way of thinking. There are certainly ways that even a wealthy lesbian black woman lacks privileges that the poor straight white male has. For example, it's well known in contemporary American society that black people have a higher risk of police violence even if they're rich, even if they're famous. There are cases of famous black people being harassed by the police merely because they were black. Wealth does not protect you from those sorts of things. So there are ways to still talk about the lack of white privilege even if someone is wealthy. So it's not very useful to talk about overall versus specific privilege. One reason we think that this work is really important is that there's a lot of resistance to talks of taking away a privilege. One thing that we think is happening is that the person reacting negatively to talk of taking away a privilege is they are thinking of an entitlement privilege when the people talking to them are thinking advantage privilege. We should not take away entitlement privileges. The person is right to make that objection. But if men on average are more likely to be hired given identical qualifications, we should take that advantage away. That is the right response. So the conflation, particularly between advantage and entitlement privilege, produces problems. And by keeping straight which privilege type we're talking about, helps us more clearly talk about appropriate social responses. So there it is, the nature of privilege. Next time, I'm going to talk about the question, do trans women have male privilege? Spoiler, not really. But as a philosopher, the real answer is a little bit longer and a lot more complicated. But at least these are some of the tools to get us starting in how to talk about, how to think about privilege. So thank you for watching. I hope you learned something. If you have a question or a comment, please drop it down below. Remember to like the video, and subscribe to the channel for future videos. Thank you.